Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me? You can say yes in the chat if you can. Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this incredible, incredible event. We're so excited to have you and to listen to these two incredible authors. Just a few little housekeeping bits from me. I'm going to just very quickly run through a few things. So we have the chat on your right-hand side. Please, please, please tell us what you think. Tell us what you're enjoying. Give our writers, a thumbs up, a cheer when you're enjoying what they're saying, which should be always because they're fantastic. We do have a little button just here. Wow, my hand looks really big like that. That says buy the book, and this is the best way that you can support our writers. We'll also have a link to Jing's book in the chat as well. This particular button takes you to Stephanie's. Also, we have a little button a little bit closer to the buy the book one. It says ask a question. Please do ask questions. Select that little button, write your question in there, and hopefully when we have time at the end, our writers will be able to address them. Yeah, so that's about it. Thank you so much for coming to this event for What's Left of Me Is Yours by Stephanie Scott. It is my greatest pleasure to actually introduce our host for the evening, Jing-Jing Lee. So Jing is a poet and novelist born and raised in Singapore. She got a master's degree in creative writing from Oxford in 2011 and writes poetry, short stories, novellas, and her incredibly moving novel, How We Disappeared, was longlisted for the Women's Prize last year. We're just so, so grateful to have Jing and Stephanie here in conversation. It's such a treat. And I'm going to mute myself and put myself on a little video so that you can't see me, because it's about time that we welcome the stars of our show. So thank you so much, and just bear with us as we do a little bit of digital toggling.
Okay.
Hi everyone, can you hear us?
Can we be heard? Okay, great. Thank you, Lighthouse, for having us tonight. I'm Jing, and I'm so much looking forward to talking to Steph about What's Left of Me Is Yours. Before I do so, I'd just like to introduce her briefly. Stephanie Scott is a Singaporean and British writer who was born and raised in Southeast Asia. She was in the Observer's Top 10 Debut Novelist of 2020, and What's Left of Me Is Yours has been chosen for the New York Times editor's pick, and was most recently longlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel and the prestigious Jalad Prize Book of the Year by a Writer of Color. I'm so excited to talk to her tonight because she's a lovely friend of mine, and this is her debut paperback coming into launch. And saying the word debut amazes me because What's Left of Me Is Yours. It's so sure-footed. It's so calm and so nuanced, and it doesn't feel like a first novel. On that note, I'm going to launch straight into the interview. I was going to say interrogation, but this is a lot friendlier than that. Okay, so Steph, could you tell us a bit about your novel? What inspired you to write it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here with me, Jing. So my novel is inspired by a true crime, a murder that occurred within the Japanese marriage breakup industry. And for those of you who don't know, Japan, like many countries in the world, has an at-fault divorce system. And so the marriage breakup industry enables you to hire someone to seduce your spouse and provide you with grounds for divorce, or at least an upper hand in the divorce proceedings. So the agents who work within this industry in Japan are known as wakaresaseya. And in the real case, a wakaresaseya agent fell in love with his target, and she fell in love with him. And she was later killed, and it turned out that he had murdered her. And he was very swiftly arrested by police. But during his confession, he repeatedly said, I love her, and I couldn't live without her, and I love her still. And I I was newly married at the time, and I was wondering if what he said could possibly be true. You know, could you love someone and kill them? Because love, obviously in its ideal form, is selfless. And then I started to think about Tolstoy and that idea that there are perhaps as many different kinds of love as there are people. And so how we love, what we're capable of doing for love, is it really love, is where the novel began.
Yeah. I mean, hearing about the case itself, just it's really startling. And yeah, before we go more into the novel, let's talk a little bit about your background.
Sure.
We were both born in Singapore, of course, and you grew up in Singapore as I did. I understand that your mother is Indian Singaporean and your father is British. So what
Yes.
drew you to Japan?
Well, I think I've had a personal connection. I feel like I've had a personal family connection to Japan that has existed before I was even born. Both sides of my family, in the Indian and the British, fought the Japanese during the Second World War in Burma and Thailand and Malaya, as it then was. My Indian family have left India several generations ago, and they moved to Malaysia and then Singapore, and they were there during the occupation, and both of my Singaporean grandparents were fluent in Japanese due to the occupation. My grandfather even wrote a book on how to learn Japanese. It was difficult to sort of survive within the occupation generally, but if you didn't speak Japanese, even more so, as you well know. And my grandmother actually met a Japanese soldier and taught him English. And she had a very unusual friendship with him. They became very close, and he remained in touch with her even after the war when he returned to Tokyo. So she had a very different experience, I think, of the war because of this friendship to, say, my British relatives who fought in Burma and Thailand. And so I had these contrasting, quite complex views of war and Japan growing up. And I have cousins who live in Japan, and my father worked there. My godchildren are Japanese. And so there was a constant sort of reiteration of that country and that culture in my life, which is why when I read this story for the first time, I read an article in the Times by Richard Lloyd Parry, who was covering this murder. It was why it interested me and drew me to it. But of course, as you know, it's one thing to have an affinity with a culture and a country, and quite another to write a novel set there with an entirely Japanese cast. So I think that's partly why this book took 10 years, and that I was really obsessed with getting it right, and my editors had to pry the manuscript out of my hands in the end to publish it. So,
I mean, exactly, like you said, 10 years. And I read a little bit about what you did during your research, and how you corresponded with the initial journalist who wrote the article that got you interested.
yes.
Could you tell us a bit about that? And I mean, you even became a member of the British Japanese Law Association, I think.
Yes.
How did you do that research? And it was 10 years. 10 years, guys. So how did you discover the shape of the novel within all that research?
That's such a good question, and actually the research and the writing went hand in hand. I never stopped. So when I read the original article about the case, I flew to Tokyo and met with Richard Lloyd Parry. He was very generous, and he shared all of his articles on the case with me. And it was at that point that I decided to depart from the case and create a work of fiction. So the real case occurred in 2010, but I actually have moved the murder case and the love story back in time into the 1990s. I think, growing up in Singapore, there are so many Japanese influences there to this day. I think it's only really increasing. But for me, certainly speaking to Japanese friends, there were so many similarities between Singapore and Tokyo in the 1990s, the school system, sort of a number of cultural features that I love that period in both countries. And so I really wanted to go back there. And that's why I set the past narrative in the 90s. And then the present day narrative Sumiko, a young lawyer who's grown up never knowing how her mother died, until one day that changes, and her present narrative is sort of discovering what really happened, and that is in present day. So I have departed from the case, but what I discovered during those early visits in Tokyo was that the Japanese legal system is fascinating and quite different to ours, and I really wanted to be utterly true to it in my depiction. And I was very fortunate in that I won a British Association of Japanese Studies Toshiba studentship for my work on the position of women in Japan, which enabled me to do further research in Tokyo. And then I also in that time worked extensively with lawyers and prosecutors in Tokyo and at the Japanese embassy in London over several years, just to make sure that I got the details right. And in the novel, there are, I suppose, three lawyers. There's the grandfather, Yoshi, his daughter, Rina. He tries to push her into the law, and she caves and then fights back. And then there's Sumiko, the youngest generation, who is a newly qualified lawyer. So it really looks at the law over different generations and over the pressures, the very human pressures that exist within it. For example, when Rina, the murder victim, is killed back in the 90s, the families of the victims would have been known, well, they're still known as forgotten parties. And what that means is that they were very much excluded from the legal proceedings. They were not notified of the date of trial, even the outcome of trial. So once they had been interviewed by the police and the detectives, they would very much be shut out of the experience and encouraged to get on with their lives and almost forget what had been done to them. And this, of course, caused a lot of grief and much trauma. And Yoshi in the novel, the way he gets around it, he's only able to get around it because he's a lawyer, and he can find out the dates of the trial, he can attend, he can do all sorts of things. But a normal layman wouldn't have been able to do that. So the novel sort of looks at the pressures that caused the system to evolve. So the law is almost a human, living, breathing thing. And by the time Sumiko's of age, forgotten parties can even be represented in court. You can have your own lawyer to speak for you. You can interrogate the perpetrator of the crime if you wish. So it's completely transformed. Of course, for Sumiko, because the crime that affected her occurred so long ago, all of the documentation is barred from her. She can't access any of it. And this caused, these issues caused tremendous problems when I was plotting and drafting, because I thought, well, forgotten parties today, they can access case files. I'll just get her to apply to the public prosecutor and she'll access the case file. But because it happened so long ago, she wouldn't be allowed to access it. Okay. And the lawyers that I spoke to were very clear. I mean, they're very law-abiding, rule-following people, and so they were saying, this is impossible. And so I had to come up with various options, and they would say, well, that's extremely naughty, and I would say, well, what about this? And they would be like, well, that is also naughty. And I was like, but naughty and possible. And they would be like, yes, possible.
But we're not endorsing it.
But no, yeah, we're not endorsing kind of behavior. This is not acceptable. But I think for me, with the research, that's as far as I take it. As long as it's possible, as long as it's plausible, then it can occur. And so how Sumiko gets the file was really an odyssey.
Yeah.
Within this little area of the law.
It was. Yeah. With that, I mean, we can go on a bit more about that, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say it revolves very much around human emotions and human frailties and human choices, which is what everything comes down to. You can have a very structured society, you can have all sorts of rules in place, but people are still people, and that's what I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and it shows in the book as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Before we kind of elaborate on that, I think my next question has to do with that. Let's just hear you. I think everybody's dying to hear you read an extract from the
Oh,
novel. So could you do that?
yeah,
Yeah.
sure, I'd love to. So, so I was talking about forgotten parties and accessing the trial documents. When Rina's killed, there wouldn't have been a jury system in place. And in fact, it would have been 3 judges who would have considered the written documents of the case alone in a chamber by themselves. So it's very much the process of reading that fascinated me here, and that relationship between the reader and the page, and the number of things that these judges take into account when they're formulating a sentence. And so Sumiko gets hold of these files through various means, and she begins to look at what the judges would consider. And this is about, and she starts to focus in on love, which is very, very important in Japanese law and sentencing. Our judicial process revolves around the issue of motive. Who, how, where, when are not as important as why. The desires that dwell in the deepest parts of the mind must be examined and proven before a sentence can be determined. Even in the most brutal of murders, the emotional state of the suspect comes to the fore. The notion of love is considered. Hatsukoi, first love. Miran, lingering attachment. Katamoi, one-sided longing. Aishao, mutual love. Fukaejo, deep love. The court will evaluate the depth of love and proffer leniency accordingly. And so it is on this intangible value that a person's fate can rest. Love, which for so many is a matter of life and death.
Thank you. Just thank you. Just
So
hearing
that
that again makes me want to dive back into the novel, because I feel like I've missed some things that we just talked about, like the the specifics that you mentioned, the different types of love, like you said. So it's very startling, and I wonder how it would have been if the tables had been turned, if Rina, instead of having been a victim, had been the killer instead.
yeah, yes,
And yeah, going on from that, what's left of me is yours, I think it's such a startling portrayal of position of women in modern Japan. You were
yes,
even awarded for that, the work you did. You were even awarded the, like I said, the Toshiba studentship for your anthropological work. So would you call your novel a feminist novel? And what do you think is the state of feminism in Japan today?
definitely, yes, definitely. It's absolutely a feminist novel. I mean, not only does it look at love in all of its possible romantic forms, but also all of its forms within a family and within a societal structure, but it's very much focused on the role of women. And I think, fascinated by the position of women globally and the constraints and restrictions that we can face even today in modern life, and that the tensions that arise between societal expectation and personal desire are such a gift for a novelist. And I think that's where a lot of my prose, that's what a lot of my prose revolves around. So it's definitely a feminist novel. And I think what's very interesting about Japan is not only the position of women in Japan itself, but how this relates to the position around the world of women around the world. And even despite the introduction of the Equal Opportunity Law in 1985, women are still in Japan expected to undertake the majority of child rearing and the running of the home. Theirs is very much a domestic sphere, even if they have jobs, and it's often frowned upon them. It's often frowned upon for women to work, or they're barred from ascending up the ladder in companies once you reach a certain point. And so they're very much confined within, they can be confined within the home, which is what Rina encounters. And I think the book is very much in dialogue with several current Japanese female writers whose work I greatly admire, like Mieko Kawakami and Sayaka Murata. These are brilliant women who are re-examining social structures and societal expectations, and you know, motherhood and the physicality of it, the self-sacrifice of it, the constraints of it, the violence of it. And so the novel is very much a dialogue with them on these themes, because, you know, Rina she gives up a great deal for her marriage, and her husband certainly has a lot of expectations for her, and yet she is, you know, it really conflicts with her personal desires. She's really unable to accept the life that she has chosen, that she's encouraged by her father to choose, but then also that she chooses, and she takes responsibility for that, for her choices, and she struggles to exist within it. And I think her husband is almost baffled that she isn't living up to her end of the bargain in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think this novel speaks to, I think, what's going on today as well, because with the pandemic going on, a lot of women have had to take several steps backwards and be at home, save the kids, and give up their careers instead of the men doing the same. And I think when I read the novel, when I read about how the different things she had to do for her daughter in order to raise her, it reminded me so much of all the things that same-parent women are supposed to do. As with Japan, they have these elaborate dinners. Same with Singapore as well. And I think you know a little bit about that. Every single night, there was an elaborate dinner, one after the other. And it's, yeah.
It is fascinating. And I think what I wanted to do was look at what Rina faces and then look at what Sumiko faces. You know, and actually, in a way, Yoshi, he pushes Rina into, he tries to encourage her to go and study law at Todai, which is also quite unusual for women. And she gets in, and actually only 1 in 5 of the students at Todai is female even today. And so that's very interesting in itself. But even though she does that, she wants to go further. You know, she wants to be a photographer. She wants to really push the boundaries, and that's too much. It's too much for everything. So for everyone, and so he encourages her to get married, and this results in almost in a sort of dissolution of the self until she meets Kai. And it contrasts as well with Sumiko, who again follows this path and is a young lawyer, but it's about her sort of finding herself within the society again, and all that is expected of her, and looking at the way in which mothers and daughters can often see themselves in each other and discover more about themselves as time goes on. I think, you know, what occurred to me with Sumiko is how much she would have lost with her mother dying young, how much she would have missed out on.
Yeah, I think you portrayed that beautifully with bio writing from multiple perspectives, particularly from Rina and Sumiko's perspective, like you just said. Could you talk a bit more about that? How did you choose to do that?
Sure. Well, I wanted to look at these issues, these evolving issues of gender and womanhood across generations, and the contrast, but also the far more emotional territory of mothers and daughters. And it was very important to me as well to reclaim Rina's story, because I started thinking about the way in which, well, the book looks at all the many ways in which women can be silenced or ignored. And just interestingly, there was recently an article in The Guardian about how the LDP party in Tokyo invites women to its meetings, but doesn't allow them to speak.
Yeah, I know. I read about that. I just face palmed.
And the head of the Tokyo Olympic Committee had to stand down because he said he's allowed women to his meetings, but they talk too much and it's interminable. Yeah. So I think all of this is really interesting, and all the Kutu movement, which is against women being made to wear heels at work and not allowed to wear glasses. And I think Mieko Kawakami puts it very well in that she says now now's the time for change. Now women are no longer content to shut up. And so I think that's very interesting, and that's at the heart of the book. But so I was talking about how women are silenced, and I think murder victims are the most brutally silenced of all. And because I read about this case in a newspaper article that was quite short and quite sparing on a lot of the family details, it was quite sensationalized. It focused on the marriage breakup industry. And I began to think of the ways in which people can become inured to the news, how these things can happen, how these strange things can happen somewhere else to someone else. And they can be too easily dismissed. And murder victims really are cut off and unable to tell their stories. And so I really wanted to explore reclaiming one's story and even rewriting personal history, which Sumiko does. Identity is such a complex and shifting thing, and Sumiko very much is very much searching for her identity through what she can remember of her mother, and through what she discovers about her. So I think that's why the portrayals of the two women were very important to me, and it's why the novel revolves around them.
I think you portrayed everybody beautifully, but I don't know. It's such a weird thing to ask, but I always had a favorite character. When I write my books. So did you have a favorite character?
Oh,
in this book?
I do actually, and it's a tough call actually, because I think Sumiko is very like me, but my favorite character is Rina. I really had to build her from the ground up. I think Sumiko emerged quite early on and in quite a developed state. She had a very strong voice. The prologue with voice was the first part of the book that I wrote, and it remained, and that voice would always speak quite clearly. But Rina was much more elusive, and so I really had to build her and from the ground up and look at all of the different aspects and features in her life, and to chart, I suppose, that dissolution of the self that I was speaking of earlier, and then her reemergence, and what her relationship with Kai leads to in terms of personal development and growth, which is quite interesting. So I really loved her, and I really do love her, and it was very hard because she's the victim. It's inevitable that she dies. It was extremely hard to kill her. That scene was very hard to write.
Yeah, it must have been, because you wrote her with such love, and it really showed through the pages.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was very moving. I mean, I didn't think. I actually thought that Sumiko must have been your favorite, but now that you explain it, it does make sense, because what you're trying to do is you're giving a voice to, well, basically a woman who has been taken away from her family.
Yes.
And so many women, it's just kind of devastating in how it's run of the mill these days, how women are just killed. And what you're doing is you're giving a voice to a character who should have stayed alive, to a person who should have stayed
and
fully
particularly
living.
because she negotiates her role within society. She fights so many battles. She, it's a constant attempt to recover her own agency, and she does that almost just before she is killed.
And that's the heartbreaking bit. Almost.
I'm sorry. It was so hard. I know, it's awful actually, because she finally realizes how she wants to be and how she should be and how she can go on. And
don't give too much away.
Oh yeah, sorry. And then that is denied her. But but these issues around femicide really, I think, obsessed me as I was writing. And particularly, I mean, the lawyers that I worked with in Tokyo, it's part of the Japanese legal training that all attorneys attend post-mortems. And they do this to really get to the heart of the crime, of what has been done to a person, to really understand what has happened. And it's very it's quite brutal. It's visceral. It's I don't know if lawyers in the UK are made to do this, but the impact that it has on them is very potent, as you can imagine. So when I was talking to a number of them about their cases, they would, describe these processes and the emotional bonds that they formed with their clients and the stories, and the way in which that caused them to reflect on their own lives and to treasure the people in their lives, which is also something I hope the book will do. I hope it will make people look more closely at everything around them and value what they have. That was one of my intentions.
It's amazing that you got these cold-hearted lawyers to tell you all these things.
It's true, and actually it did take. I think this is also why it took years, and developed friendships, and also you need quite a large group of them. You can't just torture one person.
No.
But strangely, a number of them wanted to be lawyers. Not lawyers, sorry. A number of them wanted to be novelists. And so they were quite intrigued when I would ask them questions, about the inside of the visiting rooms in prisons and that kind of thing, because you cannot get into a Japanese prison. I mean, I used a Human Rights Watch study that was contemporaneous with the novel. But I would sort of ask them things like, what's the floor made of? How does it sound beneath your feet? What does it smell like? And all the tiny details of the interrogation cells. And initially they were quite baffled, and then I think over time they became very enthusiastic, and they would sort of call me and say, well, I visited a client today and this is what it was like, and this is what the lighting was like. And I was like,
a researcher's dream.
It was marvelous.
Yeah.
but they did start off thinking I was very odd.
I mean, if any writers in training or people who are writing novels right now, take notes, because that's actually a really good tip. If you can't get to where you want to go with your novel, get someone else to go there for you and ask them questions.
Yes.
Okay, talking about writing, let's go on to a bit of a craft-ish question. Okay, what's left of me is yours is I think it's embracing of multiple genres, and it's hard to place it, I think, because the novel is set in Japan, which, because of its insular nature, renders it a completely an entire genre in itself, would you say? But the book is also what I would call partially literary true crime, if you can say that, literary true crime. So could you tell us a bit about why you chose to do this?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I very much wanted the novel to be international in outlook. So, it's told through the prism of Japanese history and culture, but it should very much relate to universal themes of humanity and how we live our lives today. But what I really want, and I think part of the cross-genre aspect feeds into that, in that I wanted to write not only a whodunit, but a whydunit. There's a murder, but I also love stories and the complexity of them. So I wanted to write a romance and really test the boundaries of what was possible within that. And then I wanted to write a story of mothers and daughters as well. And so there are many different genres that fit into the book. And I think it always wanted to be that way, particularly because, people resist categorization. I think it's one of those conundrums, isn't it, that within society spends so much of its time trying to put people into boxes and trying to define them. And it's not really natural, we resist it. And this book resisted it. And I think there are also boxes in publishing. Are you writing a thriller? Is it a psychological thriller? All of these different kinds of boxes. And my book, from the very beginning, refused the boxes, much like a human would, I think, in its defense. So that was why I mean, all of these stories, all of these different stories feed into all of our lives all of the time. Exactly. And so I wanted to write something that was not only interesting and compelling, but that was true to life experience and relatable.
Yeah, I think it filled in the gap, which I sometimes don't get from reading thrillers. However fantastic a Patricia Highsmith can be written, and they are fantastic. They're sharp, they're witty, but you feel sometimes you're lacking a little bit of warmth sometimes. And I think your novel has that warmth, that true to life, that, breath in it. You can feel people breathing in it. And
there's such pressure, I think, on authors today to pull a twist out of the hat, and no one has to see it coming, but it has to be believable. And I really wanted to center this story in its characters.
I think the twist is overrated.
Yes, really. They annoy me. So I was fighting that notion a lot when I was writing, and I really wanted to embed everything that happens within the characters themselves, so that, and I suppose there is a conundrum in the reader, because they can see some things coming, but they don't know if it's going to happen or not. And I loved playing with that tension too, getting the reader to second guess themselves, and to wonder what's going on. So it was really playing with lots of different styles and expectations, which was fun. It was quite fun.
I mean, it's always something a writer has to consider. What is the reader going to think? And sometimes you think, should I subvert the notion, or should I just go along with it and then make it just as good or even better than it would have been if I just played with the writer, dangled the mouse, as it were.
Yes.
And I think you did that very gracefully, because you lay out the ground from the start, and in the end it's still, I think, an emotional surprise. More than anything else, and an emotional charge. So
I think you can still describe the ending as a twist, but but then you can also trace back to how you might have first seen it coming, and how you might always have known, and just had a battle with yourself. Absolutely.
That's again, no spoilers. Another kind of crafty question. You use photography as a key role in narrative, particularly the love story between Rina and Kai. So why did you choose this medium? Are you familiar with photography yourself?
Well, I became a photographer for a time in the service of this novel. This novel seems to have involved a lot of deep dive immersion.
Did you enjoy it?
I did, but it was very but it was quite different to what I would normally have been drawn to, and it was quite difficult in that sense. I think when you pick up a craft, I do like photography. I'm very interested in it, but it's quite different from something that you're passionate and innately drawn to. But I really felt like I wanted to properly explore it, and particularly working with professional photographers was fascinating to me. Again, like the lawyers, when you hear them, particularly because the book focuses on film photography. And like the lawyers, when they describe all of the development processes, it's extremely tactile, it's extremely intimate, it's sensuous. I mean, I've heard photographers go into raptures about the dark room and the scents and the texture, the darkness, and the weight of the development baths, and absolutely everything. Like, there's so much personal investment, and in the development process itself, with dodging and burning, where you can literally put your hands between the paper and the light source and influence the shading of a picture, and you're physically altering this with your hands. It can say so much about the person, about the character, and so it just became the perfect medium. And if it's all right, I'll do the second reading
Yes, please. Go ahead.
which will give us a bit more of an insight into
Yes.
The power of photography and characterization.
Yeah.
Rina rested her cheek in her palm. She treasured these moments in the quiet of the night, a recent gift for them, the chance of spending an evening together. In the past months, whenever they had been apart, Rina had imagined herself in this apartment, imagined that the small studio was her home, that her photographs clipped to the walls belonged there, and that the world contained only this man and this desk and this bed. Now the fantasy had spread into reality, and it would include her whole life, her daughter. Once they found a bigger place, and soon they could be a family. Then Sumi would be with her always, and none of them need ever be apart. She looked again at the photograph in front of her. It was an experiment, part of a new sequence she was planning on intimacy, the layers between public and private life. The shot had been taken in this apartment, the camera propped up on the very desk she sat at now. She had pointed the lens towards the bed and set the timer to take the shot in 10 minutes. Then she'd sat next to Kaitarō, who was facing away from her, wrapped in a cocoon of sheets. She was still watching him when he turned towards her, and his arm curled around her waist as he rolled over in the bed. Rina looked up then, just as the shutter clicked, freezing them. She looking straight at the camera, her eyes large and dark, the freckles on her nose standing out in sharp relief. And flickering over her cheeks, Kaitarō, blurred, relaxed in sleep, his arm curving around her waist. Rina loved what she'd captured in this picture, the unguardedness of it. There was something predatory about it too, which thrilled her. Her gaze staring at the lens, capturing him, unknowing in sleep. She also loved that even in this state he was possessive, his hand grasping hers, his other arm curled around her waist. For they were both of the same mind, intertwined, each of them wearing the hint of a smile.
Gosh, that's beautiful.
But it really,
Okay.
I think, writing that scene, it was really getting into Rina's psychology. And also, again, as I mentioned earlier, her journey to rediscover her agency, to take control of her life again. I love that idea of how she is the predator, and she has the power, which is something that has been removed from her so often in her life.
Yeah.
But it's incredible, I think, what I discovered photography can allow you to do.
Yeah.
So I'm very, very grateful to the medium. If not a great photographer, I can at least create pictures with words.
I mean, you've learned so much about it in the process, so I mean,
Yes. And it's actually really interesting when you read Japanese photographers' essays, because they are extremely emotional and insightful, and one could argue more psychological than photographic essays written by Western photographers. You know, they really delve into the depths of people's lives and what has happened to them. And in Japanese, you know, the words for memory and document, kyoku, kiroku, you know, only one sound divides them. And these are used so often in essays by photographers, in that the photograph itself is a place where memory and the physical world can combine in one form that you can hold in your hand. And so that was also really pivotal to what I was trying to explore.
yeah. With that, let's talk about Kai. Rina's
Yes, he's
lover.
also a photographer.
Exactly. So, his job is, I mean, you call him a professional breaker-upper, a marriage breaker-upper. So, obviously, that job is fertile ground for a novelist. So, how does his job function in Japanese society?
Well, I think what So what interested me when I first read the article about the marriage breakup industry was that wasn't the first time I'd heard about it. I first heard about it read about it actually in the novels of Evelyn Waugh and the hotel divorces in England in the 1930s, where you could hire an actress and be seen entering a hotel with her, and this would provide grounds for divorce. So it wasn't, again, relating to the international themes and outlook of the novel, this isn't something that occurs specifically in Japan, although it does exist there. And how it exists at the moment, I think when Rina dies in the 90s, the industry was quite small. There would have been, it was just beginning really, there were a handful of firms in Tokyo, whereas now it has really evolved and expanded, and there are over 300 firms in Tokyo now, and they work around throughout Japan, and there are and they perform an array of tasks. You can hire them to not only break up relationships, but to shame people into retiring from jobs.
Wow.
You can separate children from unsuitable lovers.
Wow.
And most recently, they've started an almost a sort of, it runs in tandem to the traditional sort of marriage arrangement service, which exists in Japan, which is, where they will run a reunion service. So if you want to know what happened to your high school sweetheart and you want to get back in touch with them, they will research them and find out and engineer a meeting. So
That's not creepy at all, by the way.
Yeah, I know. It is. It's quite scary. And they're often attached to private detective agencies, so it can really run the gamut from the traditional private detective stakeout, research, observing from afar profile, to these more involved jobs. And it's interesting speaking to the agents. I think they're quite bombastic and they're very bullish about their industry, so one has to take it with a pinch of salt, but they do also claim that they work around the world. So
I mean, the weird thing is I thought that it would be kind of in a sense archaic. It feels as if we're going back in time a little bit, because you likened it to kind of arranged marriages where in some parts of the world that's completely normal, but to us, of course, that's not. And that you put them line in line with each other, that's just astounding.
And I think also that particularly in a number of Asian countries where arranged marriages still very much part of society. I mean, actually, even in my personal life, at weddings for Indian family members, my parents would be approached and asked, is Stephanie available? My mother was, I met my husband when I was 18, so the answer has always been no. But it's it's not as distant as it may seem. The point that I'm making, it's and also fascinating with regard to love and how love is viewed. Is it optimal? Is it permitted? So fascinating, and particularly in Japan, where I think seeking psychological help can be difficult. There's a lot of stigma attached to it. These wakaresaseya also claim to perform a psychological function. One man I spoke to said that he really did feel like a psychologist, that was his role, and that they're helping people move forward in their lives, and that is a very positive view of what this what it can do, what it's capable of doing.
I mean, that's what I guess what he's doing the job. He has to say
that's,
that.
Yes, that's exactly.
Okay, we have limited time left. Let's just pop in one last question for me. So did you go into the book with the title already in mind, or did you select the title while you were writing the book?
Well, actually, this title was produced under extraordinary circumstances, and that at the end of my final edits, so the book had been acquired, I'd been working on the edits for a year after acquisition, and the marketing team in America decided that they hated the original title, which was The Sentence, which of course relates to the law and the sentences in the stories we tell ourselves and construction of narrative, etc., etc. But anyway, the Americans decided they hated it, and that they wanted a new title. So I had to come up with this in 2 weeks. And also I had to write it into the novel very quickly, because for me, it's crucial that titles are embedded and that they resonate. And the first title had related to all of the characters. And I really wanted the actual title of the novel to relate to all of them as well. So that was fraught. But in the end, I came up with What's Left of Me Is Yours. And I think it does relate to all of the characters. And again, all of the different kinds of love, familial love that can exist. And in that, whenever you're in a relationship, we are also formed by the experiences of our lives and the baggage we carry. That really, when you're choosing to commit to someone, you know, what's left of you is that. It's very much a gift. And I give the words to Kai. And and it's one of the ways in which he's sympathetic, very sympathetic, I would say. And what I was also going for with that title was the sense that everyone in the novel is involved in the murder. Everyone is involved and to some extent complicit, even guilty, almost like an Inspector Calls, which I read when I was very young, where they're all guilty. I think I wanted to explore that because there's so many binaries in modern culture today, so much polarization, so much good and bad, so much simplicity, and I think throughout the novel, in a lot of ways, I really wanted to write against that, and so everyone, to some extent, is involved in what happens in Rina's death. Even her, you know, she makes decisions and choices in those moments, and is responsible for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a painful moment when you come across the reference to the title in the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is actually that. And then as a writer, so the original ending of that chapter was much softer. It was much happier. It was a lovely ending, actually, that I really liked. It was a sort of moment of peace for the reader. And at the last minute, I had to go in there and break it and create something new. So, so for all the writers out there,
yeah. I get it.
It's a shout out to what we do for our editors.
Yeah. Okay, with that, let's check the time. I think we can move on to some questions from the audience. And while I browse through the questions, everyone please be reminded that you can purchase beautiful brand new paperback from Lighthouse by clicking on the link below. Let's see.
I see one question, which is what I'm working on now.
Oh, you see it? I do not. Okay, now I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to answer it?
Yeah, sure, of course.
The question straight away, and just say it. Yeah.
It's very difficult to talk about early works in progress, so I can only talk about what I hope for it, really. But as I mentioned, my Singaporean Indian grandmother was in Malaya when the Japanese invaded and took over the peninsula and moved down into Singapore, and she had to flee the Japanese army and hide in the rubber plantations. Despite the absolute horror of that experience, whenever she would talk to me about it, what irritated her most was that she had to leave school and give up her exams and getting any qualifications. This is what bothered her the most, not an invading army or hiding in the jungle, which she did for quite a long time. So her story, she met a Japanese soldier and taught him English, and After the war, she married, she had children, and then she took herself back to school and university, and she became the first female lawyer of the largest international law firm in Singapore. And she's really the heart of our family, and she built sort of everything we are and everything we have. And she passed quite recently, sadly, but we were very close, and she was extraordinary. And I'm very interested in her journey, that trajectory from terrified girl to the formidable, inspirational woman that she became. And so I would love to explore her story in some way. But just as writing about real events is difficult, writing about family is excruciating. So we shall see how that goes. And fingers crossed. But there's certainly, and it would be a work of fiction, absolutely. But there's so much fertile ground. And I'm also interested in the way in which, because my British family, fought in Asia during the war, but then they lived out their lives in Asia. My father, though British, is fluent in Malay. He grew up playing in the kampongs with the local children. He hates England. He speaks Asian languages. He's always lived there. He won't return to London except under duress to visit me. So I'm very interested in their paths as well, and in the cultures that we are drawn to, and the lives we choose, and the places we choose to live, and the identities we create for ourselves. I think there's a lot of fertile ground there. So we must wait and see.
Okay. Okay, Nancy Bueller is asking 2 questions. Your UK cover is beautiful, she says, and the US cover is different. So do you have a preference?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I love the British cover. This is actually a woman's face pushing out of a map. You have the
Which one do I have?
You have the American one, which is great. Keep holding it.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So her face is actually the Izu. This is meant to be the Izu Peninsula, where a large part of the novel takes place, and it has all of the geographical traits, the rivers that run through it, the hydrangeas that run over the hills, that area is famous for. So the British cover is very sort of specific and poetic in its own way, and I love that it's a woman pushing through a map, pushing through a territory that has already been written and recorded, and this is her version. But the American cover is actually is possibly my favorite, simply because it's a self-portrait by the Japanese photographer Miki Takahashi, who's one of my favorite young Japanese photographers working today. And I love this shot, and I love how she looks like Rina, right down to sort of the dyed tips of her hair. And she specializes in double exposure. So it's her image superimposed into this foliage, which again is very evocative of Shimoda and the Shinto aesthetic that runs throughout the book. Miki and I are actually friends on Instagram, and so I was particularly thrilled when she allowed us to use this image.
Yeah, it's very beautiful.
So
very evocative.
I love this.
Nancy also asks, have you done an audiobook? I think the answer is yes, because you have a very lovely reading voice, she says.
Have I done a what?
Audiobook.
Oh, I thank you. I didn't read the audiobook, although it is very, very beautifully read by Hanako Footman in the UK and by Emily Ruzella in America. There are 2 versions actually, which is wonderful. They're both very different, but very beautiful. Very beautiful.
I agree with her, because I think you would have read beautifully from your own book.
Thank you. Well, I would love to. I mean, maybe the next one.
Maybe next one. Maybe next time. Okay, a question from Lighthouse themselves. Wait, pause to say that if anybody has to leave, this whole session has been recorded and you can come back using the same link to watch it again. So no worries. Okay, Lighthouse question is, given how much varied research and time this novel took, was there a moment where you felt it was all coming together in a way you had envisaged?
Yes, I think there was that moment. So I don't write chronologically. I write whatever interests me at that moment in time. And so amassing the first draft was quite interesting, I guess, in that I just reached a point where I finally had enough scenes for the full novel. I mean, I was aware of an outline of the plot, but I had them. And at that point, at the end of the first draft, I laid all of the chapters out across the floor of my living room, and I walked the novel. And this is very much how the structure of it came together, in that I literally just felt the momentum, and I felt the tensions, and I felt the areas where you need, you know, the juxtaposition of certain story elements, or you need contrast, or you need conflict. And so it was very emotional and personal, but that structure that I established through the walking actually remained. And initially, at the very beginning of writing the book, I've been very fortunate to have a couple of wonderful writing mentors, and one of them even said, this is very complicated, this structure, and your chapters are very short, and you're doing a lot of jumping, and I'm not sure it can be done, but she had changed her mind by the time the book was finished. So I'm very pleased. And I mean, also the structure was just extremely dominant. I mean, I don't think I could have contradicted it even if I had wanted to. It was very forceful. This book was very forceful.
I think it felt that way. I mean, perhaps you even needed that little bit of push from somebody else to say, this is not working, to make it even work even harder to make it work.
Yes, it's true. I did feel that, digging in your heels. I was like, it will work.
Yeah,
it will.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll show you.
Yeah, I'll show you. Exactly.
Yeah, but in a nice way, because sometimes people say that just to kind of push you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Her intentions were great, and she didn't say it in a discouraging way at all. You're right. It was a challenge. It was like, okay, make it work. And so, and yes,
you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Next question from David Leck. You already answered one of his questions, which was he wanted to know what you were working on next. But the first part of his question is, were you looking to write a novel and this new story crossed your path, or were you already working on something else?
Oh, that's a very good question, particularly since we've spoken about how forceful and pushy this book was, because I had several novels on my desk at the time, several ideas. So I was doing a PhD in Renaissance literature, focusing on the poetry of Philip Sidney, when I decided to leave academia and go into finance. And then later this led me to writing. But anyway, one of the novels was about Philip. He was fascinating, and came of age in the court of Elizabeth I and fought with her a lot about many issues, and died young, and he's an extraordinary figure, and so I could have written about him, which was very close to my research interests at the time. I could have written about my family's experience in the Second World War, either on the British side in Thailand and Burma, or again the Indian side in Malaya and Singapore. There were many novel ideas that were very close to me personally. But when I read the newspaper article about this case, the novel that arose from that, the characters that arose from it, and the issues that arose from it were so powerful. I think particularly because, that idea, could you love someone and kill them? I think I didn't think you could. I didn't understand it. And I think some of the most powerful novels arise from issues that you don't understand, and things that you don't really comprehend and want to explore, whether you change your overall view or not. I think delving into that complexity is compelling and rewarding. And this book was so forceful. It just shoved all of the other books off the desk. And I wrote a sample again for this from my mentor, and I was like, well, you know, which one do I do? And she was like, this one, clearly this one. So it very much decided itself. The second novel is quieter, actually. It's quite a different beast. Has a very different character.
I think second novels they just tend to be trickier.
Yes, elusive.
Right? Yes.
Naughty. Yeah.
Frightening. Even more scary than the first one. I mean, yeah, it's just frightening. Kind of craft question from Anonymous. How many drafts did you write for this, and were there any versions that were drastically different?
That's a good question. I think there were probably 3 main drafts. And so the first edit, which was also the sort of structural walking edit, the second edit, where I sort of polished, and then the final edit where I just fine-tuned everything and pulled all the strings in the novel to make it come together, and also did a sort of poetic edit. I love poetry, I write poetry. I'm not as accomplished as Jing. But that was very much part of my process to make every word earn its place and count. So those were the main edits that I did. But even in the final edit, it wasn't that the overall structure of the book was different, but I did have multiple versions of the same scene, just with different textures and cadences, and different angles, different speech, different mood, and I wanted to give myself lots of different options, and see which worked best. So I often would have several drafts of the same scene on the floor behind me, and would just choose.
You sound complete type A. Which I think novelists need to be type A with their work, not necessarily with everything, but you have to be, because you have to be obsessive, I think, with your work in order to make it work. Like,
I think so. I think there is the element of madness, definitely. I mean, my poor long-suffering husband, he refers to What's Left of Me Is Yours as the book whenever it comes out in conversation.
Yeah.
I think he still can't believe he's still living with the book. So,
is he having nightmares?
I haven't asked him. I don't want to go there. I don't want to give him any more ammunition.
No, just now it's published. You can go on to the next book.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
He's not looking forward to that.
Let's see. Wait, hold on. I think there's one more question from Heather. Okay. Did you resonate with Rina's story at all on a personal level? So.
Oh yes, very much so. I think the way in which it's a lovely question, and I think the way in which she wrestles with her role in society and what's expected of her. Jing, you will sympathise with this. Growing up in Singapore, my mother, when I was very young, and I should say that my mother has shaped my reading experience and is responsible for my love of literature. So this statement that I'm about to reveal is strange. It points to the complexity of the situation. She basically said, when I was 7, you can go into 2 careers, finance or law, choose. And it was very much that expectation that I go into a profession, and indeed, even when I gave up finance to write full time, there was a lot of tension, and there were a lot of practical difficulties in ensuring that could come to pass. And so I think, because I had enjoyed my time in finance, but I didn't love it. I've always known that I loved literature. Literature is all I've ever studied, and I've always wanted to write fiction. And for decades, this was just a secret, and I never told anyone. But I think to have those very powerful but silent personal desires bubbling within you. I think that was something that Rina and I really shared, and that was the point of connection between me and her. And also, also motherhood is something that has always fascinated me, and the evolution that can occur within characters once they when you have children. And I'm pregnant now, and it's an extraordinary experience, so we'll see how that goes as well. Oh, thank you. I'm just reading the chat, and it says, they're so glad I found my way back to writing. So am I. Honestly, it is. It's such a huge relief to me. It's not the financially sensible route, but it is the happiest one for me, certainly. And I'm very lucky to have been able to do it, I think.
Hi everyone. I think that we're gonna have to call it a night. I think Jing is experiencing just a couple of internet troubles, which is kind of fortunate in the timing because it's been so wonderful. So thank you to everybody who's joined us. Thank you to Stephanie. Thank you to Jing. Oh, Jing's back. Brilliant. I'll hand over.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm back. I think.
So we were just talking about
yeah
versus careers we actually want to do.
No, I could hear you. I just couldn't get back in to join the conversation.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Yes.
So I was saying congratulations and getting all excited about your pregnancy because it's a wonderful thing. And yeah, it's just that love you have for your novel, that's going straight to the next book and the baby. And yeah.
Will they fight? Will they have to fight it out? I fear they will.
Book and baby. I don't know which will be.
The baby's going to win.
Tough. Yeah, a bit of a tough fight right now. I mean, I'm having the same struggle.
Yes.
Baby is winning, clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you'll figure it out.
I think they are really forceful little creatures.
I mean, I know your American publishers do want you to get back into, or your agent, they do want you to get back into the second book. I kind of agree in a sense that you have to get back to working right now, otherwise you will never get time to yourself again. Kind of agree, but not at the expense of your health or your abuse. Yeah. So anyway, tangents. So thank you for joining us, everybody, and being a lovely, lovely audience. Again, you can get the book by clicking the link right below, and you can revisit this wonderful conversation I had with Steph by coming back to this link whenever you want. So thank you so much, and with that, I'm going to say good night.
Thank you so much for coming,
Bye, everybody. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.